In the year 70, merely decades after the crucifixion of Jesus, Rome besieged and destroyed Jerusalem. Although the Jewish people tried to resist, they were ultimately defeated, uprooted from their homeland, and scattered across the globe. Throughout their long separation from the Promised Land, the Jewish people were completely vulnerable to relentless and often violent anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust of modern Europe. Had God abandoned His people? Had He forgotten the covenant He made with them? Were there any more victories ahead for Israel? In this next episode, we will discover ancient Bible prophecy coming to pass in modern times. We will witness the return of the Jewish people to the Promised Land, and we will be awestruck by God's intervention in recent history as He demonstrates His faithfulness to the Jewish people and gives them miraculous victories in the land of Israel once again. In the year 70, just decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans and the temple was reduced to rubble. Behind me you can see some of the remains of the Jewish temple precincts from the days of Jesus. And along this wall are the massive stones that came crashing down as the temple was demolished. They are resting exactly where they fell 2,000 years ago. Despite Jewish efforts to overthrow Roman rule, the Jewish people were ultimately dispelled from their holiest city, and the land God gave them was no longer theirs. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people continued to pray for a return to Zion, to Jerusalem. But despite their prayers, they seemed to only encounter ever-increasing anti-Semitism. They had very little hope. But what hope they had was rooted in God's promises to them and Bible prophecy. In the Bible, the Jewish prophet Ezekiel, who lived in the 6th century BCE, saw an incredible vision. And in this vision, God took him to a valley that was full of dry bones. And this is what God instructed Ezekiel to do. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live." So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army, or in the Hebrew, literally, a great army of tremendous force. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off.' Therefore prophesy and say to them, 'This is what the Sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my Holy Spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." In this incredible vision, Ezekiel sees more than 2,500 years into the future. He sees the dried up hopes of the Jewish people who had faced relentless persecution and ultimately death camps. Ezekiel foresaw a day when the Jewish people would return to the Promised Land and the nation of Israel would be revived. And perhaps most miraculous of all, Ezekiel prophesied that from this small, shattered nation, an extraordinary army would be resurrected, an army with a miraculous strength to once again have the victory over those seeking her destruction. This is the land of Israel. The Bible calls this territory the Promised Land. And according to the Bible, God promised that this land would be the eternal inheritance of the children of Israel, the Jewish people today. Yet, after the time of Jesus, the people of Israel were uprooted from their land and dispersed around the globe. And without a land, they became like dry, scattered bones, vulnerable to deadly anti-Semitism, with only a fading hope that they would ever be a powerful nation again.
After the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews literally were dispersed around the world. And country after country, after the Jews had established themselves, after they had become settled, after they felt they had found a new home, they ended up having to leave. Anti-Semitism, oppression, sometimes forced expulsion, and we're talking about many, many countries of Europe. We're not talking, Spain is the famous one, the Great Expulsion in 1492. But it wasn't only there were times from England. In other countries, they were forced into ghettos and had to live miserable existence in ghettos. And this went on literally till the end of the 19th century.
All nations need homelands, and precisely in the 19th century, when nationalism becomes a huge factor in Europe, and even countries like Italy and Germany finally get their act together enough to become states, the Jewish people are also feeling that this being hounded and the wandering Jew persecuted wherever we go. It's one of the scary phenomenon of anti-Semitism, that it's the most universal hatred on the planet Earth. The notion emerges more from Jews who had left their Judaism behind, but were nonetheless culturally and historically connected to Israel, mostly Eastern European Jews, that we need a Jewish national homeland. Everyone else in the world has a homeland, and that will be the solution to anti-Semitism. We're now a stateless people at the mercy of other people with no embassy, no flag, no army, no culture. When we have those things, anti-Semitism will cease. That is the founding ideology of Zionism.
A very secular Jew, Theodor Herzl, was a newspaper reporter for an Austrian newspaper, and he was asked to cover the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus was a French army officer who had been falsely accused of working for the enemy. And it was so clear that the charges were trumped up against Dreyfus because he was a Jew. And Herzl was witnessing this as a secular, completely unaffiliated Jew, thought he was accepted in Austria and Europe as an equal. And he realized that even France, again, modern country, a liberated country, could turn on a Jew because he was a Jew. And that shocked him so much that he changed his whole worldview and realized that the Jewish future would not be in Europe. The Jews had to be like every other country, and they had to have their own state.
Herzl, after the Dreyfus affair, he realized that we are heading for another anti-Semitic explosion, and we need to do something about it. So he wanted to go for Uganda. He didn't know about the Bible. He didn't know about what God said, what God promised. He just wanted to get the people out. So Uganda was a very, very nice option. But ultimately God said it will be Israel.
Historically, traditionally, Israel has always been the homeland of the Jewish people. And a lot of Jews are confused about this point, but being Jewish is not just a religious thing. There are Jews living in Canada and America and France and England and in Russia, but that's a diaspora. The Jews are a nation. The Jewish people have a land, a language, and a history. And the Jewish people were in the land of Israel for over a millennia before they were actually exiled for 2,000 years. So part of that is a recognition, first of all, that as a unique sort of spiritual nation, the only place we can actualize our potential and our unique mission as a nation that's a light to nations is when we're plugged into our land. So traditionally, way before the founding of Zionism, which is a very new phenomenon in Jewish history, I mean, new in Israel, 100 years is nothing for Jewish history. It's always been in Jewish prayers and in Jewish longing to go back to the land of Israel, back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. That is the way Jews are supposed to be. And that is something that is deeply ingrained in Jewish consciousness. It's mentioned in all the holidays. After the Passover Seder, for thousands of years, Jews in diaspora would say, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habanuya, next year in Jerusalem, rebuilt, which means Jews back in Israel, not just the city rebuilt, but the temple rebuilt. So that's one level of understanding. That's the deepest, the oldest, most profound level. And even at a Jewish wedding, by the way, if anyone's ever been to a proper Jewish wedding, at one moment, the groom breaks a glass with his foot. Now everyone yells Mazel Tov, which is congratulations, but ironically that glass is being broken because what you say after you break that glass is Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini tidbach leshoni elichi im lo al Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my tongue cling to the roof of its mouth, may my right hand forget its cunning if I don't raise Jerusalem above all my joys. So it's like a profound understanding of the centrality of Israel and Jerusalem and the power and the spirituality that is centered in the land of Israel that is essential for the Jewish people for their mission.
While separated from the Promised Land for 2,000 years, the dim hope of returning to Zion remained in Jewish hearts through their traditions, prayers, and scriptures. And according to their prophets, God would one day bring Israel's scattered bones up out of their graves and back to their rightful land. This process is known as Aliyah, a Hebrew term with both biblical and modern significance.
Aliyah is in the Bible. It actually refers to the pilgrimage, to go up to Jerusalem. So now that the Jewish people have to come from the four corners of the earth back to Israel, again they're making Aliyah. We understand from this that there is a sanctification of the world taking place. You have the world, Israel, Jerusalem. Even in Jerusalem you have the temple, which have the temple itself, the Holy and the Holy of Holies. So all the time you see a sanctification process taking place and the holiness increases. So the moment when you come out of the world to Israel, there is a status, there's a difference in status. You are coming up to the land of Israel.
The term Aliyah literally in Hebrew means to go up. The biblical term Aliyah would mean to go during one of the pilgrimage holidays, Passover, Sukkot, which is tabernacles, or the holiday of Shavuot, to Jerusalem, to be, all puns intended, rejuvenated, to be reconnect spiritually in the temple, the national spiritual center of the Jewish people. In terms of modern Zionism, the term Aliyah would mean to go live in the land of Israel.
In the late 1800s, it was apparent that anti-Semitism was picking up again. What is interesting about the people of Israel then returning back, we're talking about a 2,000-year period where they couldn't return, and suddenly something brought it about. There's a parallel, there's a very strong parallel, firstly with Charles Warren rediscovering the city of David in 1867. In the same decade, we have Eliezer ben Yehuda reviving the Hebrew language. And in that time, again, we also see that the people are starting to come back to Israel. So all of these things coming about, that God says, in a time of favor, I will bring all these things about. And that was the catalyst that started waves of Aliyah coming back again.
You cannot separate the drive to recreate the Jewish state in Israel from the anti-Semitism. Jews would have been, it seems, satisfied to assimilate in the different countries. They wanted to be like everyone else, but the other countries wouldn't accept them. In fact, there's a biblical reference to that in the book of Deuteronomy. The Bible, the Torah says, tell you first in Hebrew, God tells the Jewish people that when you are expelled from your land because of your sins, in those countries there will be no rest for your feet, meaning you will not be able to establish yourself in other countries. And that's what happened. Every country where the Jews were satisfied, they thought they had a permanent residence, they eventually had to leave. And that was why That was the trigger with Herzl, the trigger of the modern Zionist movement, which has led to the State of Israel.
The first Aliyah is 1882. That's considered the birth of Zionism after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II unleashed this massive wave. I mean, Russia was never a good place for Jews. And we always had what was called pogroms, which was anti-Jewish violence. But with the assassination of the Tsar, which was of course blamed on Jews, it unleashed 250 anti-Jewish riots in 6 months, and that will trigger over the next, from 1882 to 1914, a mass exodus of Jews from what was the Tsarist Russian Empire. But from then onward, there'll be a series of aliyot, that's the plural in Hebrew, often triggered by different geopolitical realities. The first one was that. You'll have a large aliyah of Jews from Romania. Right before the start of World War II, when Hitler gets to power, you're going to have another wave of aliyah of German Jews desperately trying to get out of Nazi persecution in Europe to the land of Israel. Of course, at the same time, the British who are controlling the land of Israel, are putting immigration quotas on.
From the late 19th century onward, Jewish masses fleeing persecution returned to their homeland. Yet despite relentless and increasing persecution, and partly because of it, Bible prophecy was coming to pass and a time of favor was just ahead. The dry bones Ezekiel had envisioned were coming up out of their graves, and the hope of becoming a nation in their own land was at last a historical possibility. The entire Middle East was on the drawing board.
During World War I and after World War I and until World War II, there was a number of attempts by European powers to decide what to do with the Middle East. The modern Middle East is a creation of the British and the French, basically, between the end of World War I and World War II. And much of this was done not out of the sensitivities for the history, religious connections, ethnic, a country like Iraq, which is, Sunni, Shiites, Kurds, Yazidi. This is not a natural country, geographically, historically, culturally, or religiously. It was created by the British, let's say, as a payoff for various people they had to pay back for helping them in World War I, for instance, or for strategic realities like the British desire to maintain control of the Suez Canal, things like that. Starting with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and then the Balfour Declaration, which are taking place during World War I, the British and the French, who were allied fighting the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottoman Turks, who control the Middle East, are figuring out how to position themselves for post-war geopolitical strategic realities. The Balfour Declaration was a declaration issued by the Foreign Minister of England, Arthur Balfour, to Lord Lionel Rothschild, for the famous Rothschild banking family. He was sort of the lay leader representative of the Jewish community of England. And it was really an attempt to get Jewish support for the British incursion or invasion into Palestine, Syrio-Palestine, the Levant. Like, get Jewish backing, because at the time the Jewish community was living under Ottoman Turkish occupation. This was the major world empire that had been here since 1517. Lawrence of Arabia, who also supported Zionism, was doing the same thing with Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which will later become Saudi Arabia, to try and get Arab support. Like, let's rise up against the Turks, and you help us in our war effort, and we'll pay you off. So this was all this maneuvering kind of stuff.
In return for Jewish assistance overthrowing Ottoman rule in the Promised Land, the Balfour Declaration promised, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. But within just a few months of this declaration, the British, having gained control of Palestine, quickly began to backpedal on all of their promises to the Jewish people.
They felt that, first of all, strategic interests of oil, which was controlled by the Arabs, and the much larger Arab population, was much more important to kowtow to them than it was to the Jews. So starting almost immediately after, the British will issue a series of white papers, foreign policy papers, lopping off what was supposed to be a massive Jewish homeland, including what is today Jordan, giving 75% of it to Abdullah, who was the son of Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, to pay him off, because Mecca went to Ibn Saud, created a country called Saudi Arabia. We got to pay off our other ally. So we'll create two countries, Iraq and Jordan, and give his two kids little kingdoms. This is how you did things in the colonial world. But the thing that people don't realize, the most important document, conference, and treaty ever held for the Middle East is the Treaty of San Remo held in Italy in 1920. That was when the victorious Allied powers, the British, the French, the Italians, the Japanese, with the Americans spectating, created the modern Middle East. In that treaty, by the way, there are no Arab rights in what is Palestine and Israel. It is exclusively a Jewish homeland. Unfortunately, even though that treaty was used to create all these Arab countries, when it came to dealing with the Jews, unfortunately, we got the short end of the stick. So it's a kind of a tragic story with the Jewish people not only ending up with losing 75% to Transjordan, even that small little sliver of territory, by the time you get to World War II and after, the British want to subdivide that into Jewish and Arab states.
While the world was busy making and then breaking promises to Israel, God was demonstrating his faithfulness to her. After 2,000 years, the Jewish people were returning to the land God had promised them, and the historical stage was set for Israel to be reborn as a nation in her homeland once again. Yet they would not re-inherit the promised land without a fight, for the anti-Semitism that had chased them to their home had also taken root within it.
With the rise of Zionism and Jewish nationalism will come Arab nationalism, which will only be greatly exacerbated by the British putting into power Hajj al-Min al-Husseini, one of the most influential Arab families in Jerusalem. Al-Husseini became the British appointed Mufti of Jerusalem. By the way, the British will rig the election to have him win. He will found the Supreme Muslim Council, and he will buy really seriously into a lot of the medieval anti-Semitism that comes from Europe. He, by the way, will trigger a revolt against the British in 1936 to 1939. The British will then be occupying this whole piece of real estate. The British will crush that revolt brutally, by the way. He will also import that medieval anti-Semitism into the Arab world, become an ally of Adolf Hitler. It's an amazing story. The Mufti and Hitler, they really liked each other. By the way, I have great quotes of Hitler talking about how Islam would have been so much better suited for the German personality. The idea of jihad and a physical heaven with the 72 virgins, it would have been perfect for the Germans. Kind of a scary thought. Jihadi Germans, Nazis would have been a very scary thought. So there'll be a huge increase in anti-Jewish sentiment in the Islamic world, which is always there, low level, but would explode in open violence even in the 1920s. 1929, there's a huge riot in Hebron where 67 Jews are murdered, and the Jewish community is evacuated from Hebron. So when the war kicks in, that kind of quiets down because they're fighting other allies, and Hajj al-Min al-Husseini has to flee because the British are trying to arrest him, and he flees to Europe. Anyway, he dies peacefully in his old age back in the Middle East in the early 1970s. But after the war, when the British decide they don't want to have their empire, and they don't want to be it doesn't look good to be keeping Jews out of Israel and putting Jews in camps after 6 million Jews died in camps. So they throw it onto the United Nations, and the UN votes to partition Palestine.
The Arab population of Palestine, I would call them the Palestinian Arabs. So there were Palestinian Arabs and there were Palestinian Jews. Palestinian was not a name that was identified with the Arabs. In fact, it was more identified with the Jews. And the Palestinian Jews wanted independence. The Palestinian Arabs wanted the Jews out. The UN decided to split the land in two. It was giving most of it to the Palestinian Arabs.
That's the famous UN partition vote, November 29th, 1947 in Flushing Meadow, where the world voted 33-13 with 10 abstentions to partition that little sliver of real estate into Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs rejected it. Even though it was kind of untenable because it's a piece of real estate the size of New Jersey divided to two countries, and there's already 22 Arab states. Had the Arab world accepted that, born along with Israel on May 14, 1948, would have been an Arab state. Unfortunately, they never accepted it, and that's really the core issue. It's never been about creation of a Palestinian state, which has been offered multiple times by Israel and constantly rejected. It's always been, sadly, about the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size.
The Jewish population had a tremendous dilemma. Do we accept such a tiny sliver of our ancestral land? This was the land of Israel. In the end, they agreed. They said, "We'll take anything, and we'll have peace, better than nothing."
Once the UN votes, November 29, 1947, the British know they're basically going to leave. And it's sort of like you're selling your house. Okay, you made it look good to sell it, but then you're not gonna go invest any money in fixing it up. So the British decide we're not gonna risk our lives to keep things quiet here. So while the British, in the 5 months from the time the UN votes to the time they leave in May, do not allow any foreign Arab armies to invade, they do not stop the local Arab population from attacking the Jewish population, which is greatly outnumbered. Jerusalem is cut off from Tel Aviv. The Eastern Galilee is cut off from the coastal plain. The settlements around Jerusalem, the Etzion block, are cut off. The goal was divide and conquer. Cars are shot up, ambushed. Jerusalem was almost starved into submission. Well, the British are still here.
The civil war that broke out in Palestine following the UN vote of November 29, 1947, continued until May 14, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the State of Israel. The very next day, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan joined the Palestinian Arabs in a massive united effort to destroy this newly reborn nation.
It's 45 million Arabs against 600,000 Jews. An international arms blockade is called on the Middle East. Israel has no air force, no navy, no serious artillery, totally outgunned and outmanned.
The goal of the 7 nations who attacked Israel was expressed openly. It was to destroy the Zionist entity, the way they called it. There was no doubt in their minds that they would succeed. They had armies, they had air forces, they had tanks, and these are refugees primarily, and they had nothing.
Because Israel was forced to fight for her very survival immediately after her rebirth, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's very first order of business was the creation of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. The prophet Ezekiel had envisioned something like this roughly 2,500 years earlier. In his vision, once the dry, hopeless bones came to life and stood on their feet, they became a powerful army. As invading enemy armies attacked and infiltrated the Promised Land on all sides in May of 1948, Israel became just that. And stories would later emerge of the incredible battles Israel would win against all odds. This is the city of Tzfat. According to archaeologists, this city has had a nearly uninterrupted Jewish presence for over 2,000 years. It is one of Judaism's 4 holiest cities and a major center for Torah study. But from a military perspective, Tzfat is strategic. It's located on a high mountain top with a clear view of the entire north. At the end of the British Mandate in 1948, the British turned all of this city's strongholds over to the Arabs and advised the Jews to leave. At the time, there were 4,000 Jewish residents here, mostly elderly and young children. The Jews of Tzfat had terrible odds. They were outmanned by the Arabs 10-1. The Arab troops, backed by Syria and Iraq, were heavily armed, while the Jewish troops were ill-equipped, counting every bullet that was fired. But the Jewish people held their ground. It was a David and Goliath situation in Israel once again. Battles raged here for months until, at last, the Jewish fighters received an artillery piece called the Davidka, or Little David. Unfortunately, the Davidka, a homemade Israeli mortar and the best weapon available for Tzfat, was a fairly useless weapon. It was usually inaccurate and could do little damage, but it had one thing going for it. It made an incredibly loud noise. And as the Jews of Tzfat fired a series of shots, something incredible happened. It began to rain, which was unusual for that time of the year. As a result, a rumor quickly spread through the Arab community that the Jews had acquired an atom bomb, and they all fled the city in fear. This caused an incredible loss of morale among Arab troops in Tzfat, and the Jews were quickly able to secure the city. Thus, a modern David and Goliath victory for Israel was won right here in 1948, a victory that boosted Jewish determination across their homeland and secured one of the Jewish people's holiest cities. The ancient Jewish city of Sfat is just one example of an inexplicable victory being won by Israel over her enemies. Although the IDF endured many losses, after only 3 weeks of fighting, Israel was able to halt her enemies, stabilize the front, and initiate successful offensives. By the end of the war, Israel had not only managed to drive out invading Arab forces, she had also gained 5,000 square kilometers over and above what the United Nations had allotted to her.
Militarily, it was a success for Israel. Israel survived, that's the first thing. Israel expanded to more reasonable borders that were survivable. It was a great tragedy. 1% of the population was killed in the war. That's an enormous number of people. Many of them were Holocaust survivors. They'd managed through the Holocaust, they'd managed through concentration camps, came to Israel, and as soon as they got there, they were coming into a battle. They had to pick up a gun.
That will be Israel's longest war, the War of Independence. By the way, it's Israel's costliest war. It will last for over a year off and on, with several ceasefires that are broken. In the end, Israel will end up with more territory than it started out with. The one big loss will be Jerusalem. The old city will be taken by the Jordanian army. And north and south of Jerusalem, large areas of territory, which Jordan had no right to because it was across their international boundary, will be occupied by Jordan until the 1967 Six-Day War. And Egypt will occupy the Gaza Strip. But the avowed aim of that war, is openly, they state, this will be a war of the Secretary General of the Arab League, Azam Pasha. He says this will be a war like the Mongolian massacres or the Crusades. We are going to slaughter the Jews and push them into the sea. That was the goal, was to wipe out a Jewish state before it could ever come into existence. Thank God that did not succeed, but that's what it was all about.
That war itself was miraculous. Of course, there was strategy, of course, there was planning, but it was miraculous that the incredible power of 7 regular armies could not defeat Israel. In fact, that Israel succeeded and grew in size. So that's a miracle that is still celebrated by many religious Jews today, and as a great miracle of God, as part of His promise for the return to Israel.
Just like Ezekiel had envisioned, God had brought Israel back to her land and out of hopeless, dry bones. God had not only resurrected a nation, He had resurrected an army. Although at the beginning of the War of Independence, Israel's army had numbered a mere handful of full-time soldiers, by the end of the war in March of 1949, the IDF consisted of 100,000 men and women, plus several regiments of artillery. Israel was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Israel's enemies would need to greatly improve their capabilities in order to achieve their united goal to destroy Israel. And by 1967, Israel's enemies were ready to succeed in this military objective.
67, this is 19 years later. This was a few less Arab armies, but this is today, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan on all of our borders, basically surrounded. Once again, Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in charge of Egypt, is saying this is the war to obliterate Israel. You have to see the images. We don't appreciate this. Digging mass graves in Jerusalem, people putting sandbags in the front of their houses. This is that it's going to be a slaughter. Thousands and thousands of Jews are going to die.
The Israeli government, before the war started, asked the chief rabbinate to turn the public parks into temporary cemeteries. They were expecting hundreds and possibly thousands of civilian casualties if these armies actually broke through and got into the cities. They were expecting that, and that they went as far as sort of preparing them to be temporary cemeteries. Israel was still a very young state, 19 years old. Army was tiny compared to the armies of Jordan, Syria, Egypt around them. And the Arabs decided this was the right time. The Arabs decided that they could defeat Israel. They were strong enough to defeat Israel. The Egyptian government demanded that the UN forces that were separating Egypt from Israel leave the Sinai Peninsula, and they left, and then all of a sudden Egypt massed its troops at the border. And you've got Jordan. I'll never forget, I was a child and I remember looking in the newspapers. I was living in the United States at the time. And every day the newspapers would show these pictures of how this war was going to look like. So for every 1,000 tanks, they would put one tank and one tank. And you saw all of Syria had, many more, all these tanks lined up. And all these people and all these soldiers, each one represented another 1,000 or 10,000 soldiers. And you see this massive thing in these giant countries surrounding this tiny state.
And then what happens? It was amazing, Israel, the Egyptians closed the Straits of Tiran and the Red Sea, which is an act of war, blockading Israel's port. Israel's Air Force preempts by taking out the air forces of all three of its enemy countries, who stupidly would not communicate with each other because of their egos. The Egyptians describing we're bombing Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, the Air Force was destroyed. The Six-Day War ended in the first day. In modern warfare, when your Air Force is eliminated, then your armor is completely exposed. Egypt was destroyed. The Egyptian army was destroyed in the first day of the war.
Egypt and Syria announced to their people that they had bombed Tel Aviv, that they had bombed Haifa, that Israel's refineries were burning up. All of it was false. All of it was propaganda. What did it do, though? It caused Jordan to decide to enter the war. Jordan was afraid that Syria and Egypt were going to divide Israel in half, and Jordan wanted Israel as well. Jordan wanted the rest of Jerusalem. Jordan had been occupying Jerusalem until that point. So even though Israel sent messages and begged Jordan not to fight, Israel didn't want Jordan to fight because it was enough for us to fight on two fronts. We didn't have enough soldiers to fight on three fronts. Jordan refused, and they started bombing civilian targets in Jerusalem.
I mean, the first real miracle was the fact that Israel took out the air force of all of its enemies within the first day of the battle, which ends the war, practically speaking. Egypt is knocked out right away. That will enable, by the way, the paratroopers who are supposed to be fighting the Egyptians in the Sinai to be immediately sent to Jerusalem and fight the Battle of Ammunition Hill, which is an incredible battle where these paratroopers had no idea. They had one bad, grainy aerial photograph of what was a fortified Jordanian position to the north of the Old City, sitting on a critical road connecting Ramallah to Jerusalem, which was needed to keep the Jordanian army from coming south to come to the aid of Jerusalem. They were told there was 50 Jordanian soldiers there. It happened to be there were 150 Jordanian legionnaires, the best Arab army in the Middle East. Now, in normal warfare, it's supposed to be 3-1, the attackers against the defenders. It ended up being the same number of Israeli paratroopers fighting the same number of Jordanians who were entrenched in positions with bunkers and machine guns and pillboxes like Normandy Beach. It's an incredible story where they go into this battle at 2:30 in the morning. All the officers are killed or wounded right away. They fight 4.5 hours in the trenches in an area 200 yards square. In the end, there's 38 Israelis killed and 71 Jordanians killed, and they take this position. It was an incredible battle. By the next day, the old city's in their hands.
Jerusalem was split at the time, and they started bombing West Jerusalem. And there were casualties, and then the Israeli army started fighting back in Jerusalem. And then it took 3 days, we conquered the old city of Jerusalem.
On the morning of June 6, 1967, having conquered the last Jordanian stronghold on the Mount of Olives, Israeli soldiers entered the Lion's Gate of the old city of Jerusalem. Cautiously and reverently, the Jewish soldiers advanced toward the Western Wall, the last remaining wall of the Jewish temple. As they approached their holiest site, the soldiers recited an ancient Jewish prayer. "Blessed art thou, Lord God, King of the universe, who has sustained us and kept us and has brought us to this day." For the first time in almost 2,000 years, Jerusalem was completely in Jewish hands. It is difficult to summarize how profound this moment would have been for these Jewish soldiers, for Israel, for Jews all around the world. Their affections for this holy city are best summarized in the Bible. While in exile in Babylon, one psalmist expressed the Jewish longing for Jerusalem in this way: "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. And may my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. On June 7th, 1967, the hopes and dreams of every Jewish heart around the world became a reality. God had not forgotten his people. He had heard their prayers. Not only had he brought them back to their land, God had given his people a miraculous victory over their enemies and ensured that Jerusalem, the heart of the Promised Land, was once again in the hands of the Jewish people, the people to whom she truly belonged.
If you see the reaction of Israeli soldiers like the paratroopers at the wall, this was a war we're fighting for our survival, and within 6 days, within 72 hours of the war starting, we're at the Western Wall and Jerusalem is under Jewish sovereignty for the first time in 2,000 years. People were just shocked. Every Israeli was suddenly like religious. All these secular Israeli paratroopers like crying at the wall. You have to read the accounts. I'm not a religious man, but I'm standing at the Western Wall for the first time in 2,000 years under Israeli sovereignty. It was really quite amazing.
Standing center to the Six-Day War is the reunification of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been ticking on a time clock according to God's schedule. Firstly, she was rediscovered in 1867. 50 years later, which is the Jubilee here, which always speaks of the liberation, she was liberated from the Ottomans in 1917 by Allenby. 50 years after that, again she was liberated through the reunification of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. And exactly 50 years again after that, following another Jubilee cycle, President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the American embassy, meaning that he acknowledged Jerusalem and her rightful place as the eternal city of the Jewish people.
The prophecies of the Bible talk about the Jews coming back to Israel and Jerusalem being the center, and the Temple Mount area being the center of the Jewish life. And we were missing that all those first 19 years. Jordan had illegally occupied that land. I say illegally, the international community did not recognize it. There were only 2 countries who recognized Jordan occupation of what they called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem. Israel now, in the Six-Day War, got Jerusalem and then continued until the Jordan Sea, all of Judea and Samaria.
So Israel ends up literally in 6 days defeating 3 Arab armies, tripling its territory, suffering less than 800 casualties. Of course, Israel's a little state. Today, every Israeli soldier, every Jew killed in Israel is the equivalent of 50 Americans killed, proportioned to the population. So it wasn't miraculous in that the Egyptian planes didn't fall from the sky, but there's stories about people just not teaching the Six-Day War because, there's a story about West Point. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but when asked why they don't teach the Six-Day War as military strategy, the officer says, we don't talk about miraculous victories. That's not strategy we reproduce.
Israel completely stunned the world as she defended herself against 3 powerful Arab armies, once again rapidly expanding her borders. Amazingly, Israel managed to capture the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, West Bank and Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria.
Syria had turned the Golan Heights, which sit above the Sea of Galilee and above the northern part of Israel, the narrowest part of Israel is that Galilee finger, into the most heavily mined, fortified place on the planet Earth, with trenches, machine gun positions, artillery, unbelievable. The last day, June 10th, the Golani Brigade literally charges uphill 1,200 feet through all of that and takes the Golan Heights from Syria. So wherever you look, it was just incredible victory after victory and massive, humiliating setback for Arab armies that were just much larger and by all normal laws of history should have won. But because of a series of seeming coincidences, incompetence, lack of communication, blew it in a way that's unimaginable, enabling Israel to win in the fewest amount of days with very minimum casualties, one of the greatest military victories in all of human history.
I'm here in the Golan Heights, near the border between Israel and Syria. Before the Six-Day War, Syria controlled these strategic hills, and the Jewish farms and communities in the valley below were vulnerable to shots that were commonly fired down upon them while they went about their everyday lives. Toward the end of the Six-Day War, however, this all finally came to an end. It was an uphill battle for Israel as they struggled against the 75,000 well-fortified Syrian troops here. It was estimated through the battle that Israel would likely lose about 30,000 lives. But after just 7 hours of fighting, Israel began to gain ground. The next morning, fighting was expected to continue, but unbelievably, before fighting began, Israel's enemies frantically fled, leaving their weapons behind. Israel's victory over the Golan Heights was her last in the War of 1967. By the end of the war, Israel had not only won a victory over 3 nations that far outgunned and outmanned her, Israel managed to conquer more of the Promised Land and had tripled in size. Most importantly, the city of Jerusalem, and specifically the Jewish people's most holy site, the Temple Mount, was back in Jewish control after nearly 2,000 years. But there was another war ahead of Israel, again initiated by enemies wanting to exterminate her, and once again, it would be a miraculous victory for Israel. It was October 6, 1973, and the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. Once again, a coalition of Arab nations initiated war against the nation of Israel. But this time, Israel's enemies were even more prepared than before, and Israel was completely caught off guard.
You look sometimes at patterns that you see laid out in the Bible. Then we actually saw something similar after the Six-Day War. The Bible talks, for example, in Deuteronomy also about sometimes when people got too much or had too much, they became a little bit conceited about it and arrogant about it and overconfident about it. Well, that seems to be what happened after the Six-Day War. The Israeli population was flying. Everybody was so happy, and the Israeli government believed that we were now invincible, no Arab country would attack us.
Israelis were flying high from the 67 war. I mean, Ariel Sharon, before was one of the few cocky generals who was later prime minister. Before the 67 war, he was optimistic. He said, we finished with the Arabs in this war, they're not gonna mess with us for like 3 generations. Fast forward, the Arabs learned their lessons. They build up a lot of equipment. They make up for their shortcomings with they realize the Israeli Air Force is a formidable force. Russia is backing them with very sophisticated anti-aircraft missile systems that are going to wreak havoc on the Israeli Air Force. Shoulder-fired missiles that are going to wreak havoc on Israeli armor.
The Israeli army saw the signs, saw the weapons, saw the buildup, and saw the masses of soldiers, coming right before in 1973. And yet, they had the wrong decision. The decision was not to attack and to let the Egyptians and Syrians have the upper hand. And of course, it was a tragedy beyond belief. They attacked, and on Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur, of course, it's a fast day. The Israeli army, there were people who didn't even know. They were sitting on the borders, and all of a sudden the Egyptian soldiers were shooting at them, and the Israeli army had not notified them that this was about to happen. There was a slaughter, unfortunately, in those first few days. A cousin of mine was killed near the Suez Canal on that day, and they didn't have a chance.
Israel was, there's a famous line in the Bible where God says to the Jewish people, you'll get comfortable, you get fat, you'll get lazy, and you'll say, Kochi va'otzem yadi asiti et hachayil hazeh. By my might and my strength, I did this. And Israelis we're invincible, and then boom, despite being warned, being told by the US, everything, that they were going to be attacked, Israel partially mobilized, thank God, But Israel was caught literally with their pants down, like completely off guard. By the way, the Arabs made a big mistake attacking on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. That's the one day when even most secular Israelis are at home, and minimum soldiers on the borders, everyone home in their synagogues. This is pre-cell phone, but this is the easiest day of the year to find everyone. The army literally ran around and went to synagogues and pulled all the men who were all the reservists, which is most of the Israeli army is a reservist army that has to be mobilized, out of the synagogues and sent them to the fronts.
On Yom Kippur, Israel, of course, made the announcements around the country. They called up all the reserves and fought back, and eventually were able to defeat the Egyptian army, defeat the Syrian army, actually get more territory than we even had before the war. But the cost was incredible.
Initially, by the way, the Egyptians smashed through the Bar-Lev line, the Israeli fortification on the Suez Canal. The Syrians, with a massive armor presence, punched huge holes through the Israeli lines. There's incredible stories of Israelis holding out, of a few Israeli tanks holding out against the entire Syrian armor corps and suffering massive casualties. But the problem, by the way, with the Arab armies was they didn't have a plan to go further. They got their initial objectives, and then when they went past it, when the Egyptian army decided to go past its anti-aircraft missile coverage into further in the Sinai, then Israel counterattacked. Ariel Sharon will miraculously, an incredible maneuver, will cross the other side of the Suez Canal as the Egyptians are on the Israeli side, cut a hole between two Egyptian armies, surround an entire Egyptian army, and almost starve them to death. It was so bad the Soviet Union was threatening to nuke Israel. And the Syrians in the north also will get to the end of the Golan Heights looking down on Israel and completely run out of steam. They have no plan how to go. And Israel's able to mobilize, counterattack. The Israeli army at the end of that war, although it suffered initially horrendous casualties, especially the Air Force and especially the Armor Corps, are on the road to Cairo and the road to Damascus. It's only because of pressure from the US and Russia that they didn't take the capitals. They could have taken the capitals of those two countries. So yes, it was a victory, and in many ways a bigger victory than '67, but they say pride goes before the fall. A lot more suffering. Golda Meir's government, they had to resign. They were accused of being incompetence and not seeing the writing on the wall. And it was a big ego deflation for the Jewish state. So another miraculous victory, but at a much heavier price.
The history of the modern nation of Israel, much like the history of Israel that is recorded in the Bible, is a story full of astonishing miracles and terrible tragedies, a history of some battles lost, but many incredible battles won. Yet from the very first wave of modern Aliyah to the last war that should have meant her destruction, God's faithfulness to Israel is evident in the modern nation of Israel. Just as Ezekiel foretold, the scattered bones of Israel have emerged from the nations of the earth, returned to the promised land, and become an incredible army.
In the time of the Exodus out of Egypt, Israel is being referred to as the armies of God. They came out in their legions. Again, in the prophecy here, it speaks of it as well. Again, we just see Israel coming full circle, standing as a vast army before God.
According to the Bible, the people of Israel were destined to live in the Promised Land and fight for it if need be. This is because, roughly 4,000 years ago, God promised Abraham that his descendants, the Jewish people today, would become a great nation in this land. And from here, Israel's role was to bless the world and shine as a light to the nations. Despite Israel's imperfections, in the Bible or modern times, this remains Israel's God-given purpose, but this calling has never been easy.
Israel has always been against the odds. We can see that on a micro level and on a macro level. Even if you look at David's life, certain righteous people within the biblical narrative, it's always being set up against the odds. So again, the nation of Israel as well. But we have a song that we sing in Pesach that really captures this whole idea so beautifully. והיא שעמדה לאבותינו ולנו, שלא אחד בלבד עמד עלינו לכלותנו, אלא שבכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לכלותנו. Israel has survived. It's the eternal people of God. Where is Rome? Where is Babylon? Where is Persia? Where is Greece today? Even Nazi Germany and the mighty Spain. None of these empires exist anymore. But the Jewish people, because they are the covenant people of God, still exists. And they are now at the point of taking up that part of becoming a light unto the nations.
How is it possible that a people uprooted from their homeland for almost 2,000 years managed to endure endless persecution with no homeland and then survive modern Europe's attempts to systematically exterminate them? And how, after all of this tragedy, did this broken and traumatized people rise to become a nation in their homeland again? And where? Where did they find the strength to defeat a sea of enemies surrounding them? Enemies with the clear intent of wiping Israel off the map once and for all. That the people of Israel have survived is a miracle in and of itself. But the fact that they have repeatedly been able to win incredible victories over their enemies, enemies with an enormous advantage over them, that is mind-boggling. Could it be that God is really still faithful to Israel? Could it be that He has preserved her and come to her aid in modern times in order to ensure her continued survival? In the Bible, God has made everlasting promises concerning Israel and the Jewish people, promises that He has bound Himself to keep. Listen to this one, found in the book of Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says: He who appoints the sun to shine by day, who decrees the moon and stars to shine by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar, the Lord Almighty is His name. Only if these decrees vanish from my sight, declares the Lord, will Israel ever cease being a nation before me. God is keeping His promises to Israel. He has decreed that she continue to survive. And when her survival is threatened by enemies wanting to destroy her, God still comes to her aid. She has not won every battle. Her losses have been severe. But ultimately, God has resurrected Israel, and out of hopeless, dry bones, He has made an incredibly powerful army. He has kept His word. As Christians, this should be of great comfort to us. If God is faithful to Israel, then we can be sure that He will be faithful to us as well. Perhaps you personally relate to the dry bones in Ezekiel's prophecy. Perhaps you are struggling to find hope in whatever situation you are facing. Israel stands as a powerful demonstration of God's faithfulness and His continued power to resurrect dying hopes. Remember that it is often in the darkest, driest valleys, when all hope is lost, that God comes in, and with dry, scattered bones, He does something incredible. He resurrects a powerful army that has unbelievable cunning and strength to win victory after victory over her foes. If this is our God, and if He has done this for Israel today, imagine then what He can do for you.